Hello and welcome to Threads of History. I'm Paige and today we're going to be going through why the Ptolemaic dynasty practiced sibling marriage. So you're probably well aware that plenty of dynasties from throughout history have practiced incest, but not a lot of them actually practice full sibling incest like the Ptolemaic dynasty. Of the 14 to 15 known Ptolemaic kings that ruled Egypt, 10 of them married closer than full cousins and 9 of those married their sisters. And this wasn't just once each. Some of them married several times. For example, Ptolemy VIII married both his full sister and his niece, and she was his niece through the full sister that he married and his full brother, who his full sister had previously been married to. You also have Ptolemy IX, who married both of his full sisters. So I know what you're thinking. Ew! But also, why would a dynasty choose to do this?
Why?
Well, today we're going to assess the potential motivations the dynasty may have had for practicing full sibling marriage. But first of all, this is available on both YouTube and Spotify and But if you're going to be doing something while you listen to this, there's also a textual version in the description down below that also has all of the images that I'm going to be showing and that cites all of the sources that I have used. It also has information on future series that I plan to do as part of Threads of History if you're interested. So you can check that out in the description down below. So if you don't know who the Ptolemies were, that's okay, because we're going to be going through their family tree, focusing specifically on their marriages, and then we're going to be going into how incest might have affected them, because I think that's pretty interesting, something that most people would generally wonder, and then we'll go into ancient views of incest, and specifically the relationship between Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II, as they were the first full sibling marriage in the dynasty. Then we'll go into all the potential motivations that the Ptolemies might have had, including dynastic security, the king's sister, Egyptian predecessors, and ideology around excess and divinity. So who were the Ptolemies? Well, the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt from about 305 or 6 BCE until 30 BCE, when Cleopatra VII died and the region was incorporated into the Roman Republic. From the 6th century BCE, it had been under Persian control until it was conquered in 332 BCE by Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great was a young Macedonian general who conquered a massive land empire that spanned all the way from Greece down to Egypt and all the way across to India, as you can see on the map. At the age of 32 in 323 BCE, though, Alexander the Great died. Diodorus Siculus describes his final words as follows. His friends asked, "To whom do you leave the kingdom?" And he replied, "To the strongest." He added, and these were his last words, that all of his leading friends would stage a vast contest in honour of his funeral. Which just sounds like he was trying to... he was trying to start shit. You can't tell me that he said, "To the strongest." Like, that's so shitty of him.
Bitch, you better be joking.
But it is very funny, and naturally it led to a lot of tension and conflict among his successors, who were the Diadochi, which included 3 Diadoch wars. So Ptolemy, who was previously a general of Alexander, was appointed satrap, which is basically governor, of Egypt by the new Macedonian king, Philip Aridaeus. Now, Aridaeus was the brother of Alexander, and we believe that he was very likely to have been disabled, and unfortunately he was never really taken seriously. And at this time he was kind of set up as a figurehead for the Macedonian kingdom, while real power was in the hands of the chiefs that were serving him, especially Perdiccas. Now, Ptolemy wanted Egypt, and because he wasn't really seen as a major contender for power, he was given it in exchange for recognizing Perdiccas and basically allowing Aridaeus to have control over Alexander's funerary arrangements. Ironically though, he stole Alexander the Great's body, and when he was sent to Egypt, even though he wasn't seen as a major contender for power, he did have a deputy sent with him who he also ended up killing. So he was very, very quickly solidifying himself as a major threat. In 306 BCE, he declared himself as Pharaoh of Egypt. This was following Antigonus, one of his fellow successors, who had declared himself as king of Alexander's kingdoms. Interestingly, we actually see Ptolemy I beginning to conform to traditional ideas of Egyptian kingship. So this included supporting temples, funding building projects, especially in Alexandria, and presenting himself as Egyptian in art, such as the bust shown on screen, where he looks Egyptian. He does not look Macedonian. Now, Ptolemy married several times, but only once did he do so for political reasons, and this was to Eurydice, the daughter of the Macedonian regent Antipater. However, he did establish a lot of political alliances through his children and stepchildren. For example, his daughter with Eurydice, named Lysandra, was married to her cousin Alexander V, who was a son of the Macedonian king Cassander. When Alexander V died, she remarried Agathocles, who was the son of Lysimachus, the king of Thrace, Asia Minor, and Macedonia. Ptolemy also married his daughter Arsinoe II, who he had with Berenike, to Lysimachus, who was actually in his 60s at the time. So in return, Lysimachus married his daughter Arsinoe I to Ptolemy II. Ptolemy II was the son of Ptolemy I and Berenike, and he was established as co-ruler alongside his father in around 285 or 284 BCE. Upon his father's death in 282 BCE, he became the sole ruler of Egypt. And just to clarify, these are modern naming systems. They didn't refer to themselves as Ptolemy I, Ptolemy II, but we do this basically for clarity because they all have the same names over and over and over again. But these alliances fall apart when Arsinoe II accuses Agathocles, who was the husband of her half-sister Lysandra, of trying to usurp power from his father and her husband, Lysimachus. In response, Lysimachus executes his son. Lysandra flees to the Seleucid kingdom, which was another Hellenistic kingdom, alongside her brother, Ptolemy Kourounos. With the followers of Agathocles, the siblings then attack and kill Lysimachus. Kourounos takes the throne and marries his half-sister Arsinoe II to kill the heirs of Lysimachus. Arsinoe II then flees to Egypt and Kourounos is killed by invaders. In Egypt, Arsinoe II and her sister-in-law Arsinoe I clash, and in around 275 BCE, Arsinoe I is exiled for conspiracy. She was either conspiring to kill Ptolemy II to put her own son on the throne, or he falsely suspected her of this. And if he did falsely suspect her, was Arsinoe II behind this? We don't actually have any solid evidence of this, but it is possible based on her previous history. Alternatively, Ptolemy may have wanted to rid himself of Arsinoe I as she was no longer diplomatically valuable now that her father, Lysimachus, was dead. In around 273 or 2 BCE, Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II marry. Now this marks the first full sibling marriage in the Ptolemaic dynasty.
It's more than dating.
We're siblings.
Siblings by chance. Lovers by choice.
And the union was actually a massive focus of their reign. They adopted the epithets Theoi Adelphoi, which meant sibling gods, and Philadelphus, which meant sibling lover. They didn't have any kids, and Ptolemy II's heir was his son from his previous marriage to Arsinoe I. It was Ptolemy III. I guess it looks a little bit weird that Ptolemy I married off all of his children to create these political alliances, and after he dies and they kind of fall apart, Ptolemy II, seemingly without precedent, just decides to marry his full sister. It kind of makes it seem like he was maybe a little bit too into her, I suppose.
What are you doing, bro?
That is possible, but one weird guy in the dynasty wouldn't really explain its continued practice and emphasis throughout the rest of the dynasty. Now, their son, Ptolemy III, didn't marry his sister. He actually married his second cousin, Berenike II, daughter of Magus of Cyrene. And we're going to have to get used to looking at this dynasty, cousins kind of becomes, oh, thank goodness, even though it's still kind of inbreeding. That is like the furthest that we're going to get. And we can see here that Ptolemy III was trying to, like his grandfather, establish political connections through this marriage. But his son, Ptolemy IV, married his full sister, Arsinoe III, and this couple actually had a child, which marks the first full sibling union to actually have offspring in the Ptolemaic dynasty.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
Their son, Ptolemy V, however, was orphaned young, and he instead married his third cousin, the Seleucid princess Cleopatra I, who was the daughter of Antiochus the Great. They had 3 children together, Ptolemy VI, Ptolemy VIII, and Cleopatra II. All these children were also orphaned quite young. Now, Ptolemy VI married his full sister, and they had 3 to 4 children together. But Ptolemy VI died in around 145 BCE, and with his children either deceased or too young to rule, Cleopatra II was married to her full brother, Ptolemy VIII. And we can actually see clear motivation here. It wasn't just that they were a bit weird. On top of seeing that it's already becoming a pattern within the dynasty, we can also see that they needed a king and they needed to protect the Ptolemaic throne, and so they brought in a brother to make sure that it stayed within the family, in more ways than one. Now, shortly after Ptolemy VIII married his full sister, he either raped or seduced Cleopatra II's daughter, Cleopatra III. So she was his niece through both of his siblings, and he fathered a son to her before marrying her, marking the dynasty's first uncle-niece marriage. So now that they were married, both Cleopatra II, referred to as the sister, and Cleopatra III, referred to as the wife, were ruling as queens alongside Ptolemy VIII. So we had 3 co-rulers at once. Now, Ptolemy VIII and his niece wife, Cleopatra III, bore 5 children. One of their sons, Ptolemy IX, married both of his full sisters, which were Cleopatra Selene and Cleopatra IV, while their other son, Ptolemy X, took after his father in marrying his niece, Cleopatra Berenike III, who was the daughter of Ptolemy IX and Cleopatra IV. Now, Ptolemy X died, and Ptolemy IX was brought in to rule alongside his daughter, who was the previous king's widow. Although some have tried to argue that Ptolemy IX married his daughter, Asia points out that there's not evidence of this, nor is there any precedent in the dynasty for marriage within the direct line of descent. Now, Ptolemy IX dies in 80 BCE. Cleopatra Berenike III's cousin and stepson, Ptolemy XI, was brought in and married to her. Bennett suggests that they might have also shared a mother, making them half-siblings on top of being cousins, and Cleopatra being his stepmother because she was married to his father, Ptolemy X. Either way, their union didn't last long because Ptolemy XI did something really stupid and murdered Cleopatra during their honeymoon. Now, the Alexandrians had loved Cleopatra, and so they dragged him into the gymnasium and literally tore him to pieces. Now, after this, Ptolemy XII became king. He was the son of Ptolemy IX and an unknown mother, as suggested by rumours of illegitimacy. He might have been the son of Cleopatra IV or Cleopatra Selene, who were both the sister wives of Ptolemy IX. He married Cleopatra V, who was either his half or his full sister. One of his children included Cleopatra VII, who we today know simply as Cleopatra. She might have married both of her half-brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV, but Asia is skeptical of whether these actually occurred, and if so, it seems that they were definitely unconsummated. She did, however, bear a child to Julius Caesar, which seems like a political strategy, no doubt, and following Caesar's death, she married Marcus Antonius, or Mark Antony, who was Caesar's right-hand man. The pair had 3 children together. The Ptolemaic Empire fell in 30 BCE, when Cleopatra and when she and Antony were defeated by Octavian and both died by suicide in 30 BCE. Octavian was Mark Antony's rival for power, as he was the posthumously adopted son of Caesar, and I think also his great-nephew biologically. Octavian was soon to be known as Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Cleopatra and Antony's children were raised by Antony's previous wife and the sister of Octavian, Octavia. My lecturer actually called her like a saint when we were talking about her because she just takes in all of these children. So we don't actually know what happened to the 2 sons, but the daughter, Cleopatra Selene, married Juba II, the king of Mauritiana. For more information on Cleopatra Selene, Jane Draycott released a book, I think within the past few years, called Cleopatra's Daughter, From Roman Prisoner to African Queen. So if anyone's interested, I haven't read it, but I would read it. It looks like a pretty good source, and it's pretty recent, and it looks like it's something that's written for the general public. It's like quite accessible. We also know of the fate of Caesarion, or Little Caesar, who was the son of Caesar and Cleopatra. As the legitimate heir of Caesar and of the Egyptian throne, he was unfortunately killed by Octavian. So throughout the dynasty, we can see this clear strategic pattern of incest consistently being implemented, and it wasn't often a choice that was being made by those within the union. It was something that was often ordered. We see brothers or whatever being brought in to marry women after their partners have died or after their fathers have died or whatever, so that the throne can be protected. And in this way, full sibling marriage kind of became a model that the Ptolemaic rulers had to follow. So how badly did it affect them? When we think of the effects of inbreeding, we often think of King Charles II of Spain. He's kind of considered the epitome of like the ugly inbred ruler with all these health issues. But his dynasty didn't even have full sibling marriages, not many did. So how bad was it for the Ptolemies? While scholars have speculated on the potential physical effects that inbreeding had, such as reduced fertility, increased mortality rates, and genetic disorders. But some have also argued that inbreeding resulted in moral depravity. Peter Green claims that the Ptolemies became selfish, greedy, murderous, weak, stupid, vicious, sensual, and vengeful as a result of their inbreeding. Michael Grant claims that Cleopatra II inherited a total absence of moral sense and a tendency to murder her brothers and sisters. Before the Ptolemaic dynasty even became incestuous, we had Ptolemy I stealing the body of Alexander and Ptolemy Kouranos marrying his half-sister to kill her offspring. So incestuously caused moral depravity obviously had nothing to do with these acts, and we have so many awful things that happen throughout history that people do to one another within a family that have nothing to do with incest. Aja is right in pointing out that the behaviour of the Ptolemies was probably a result of nurture, or lack thereof, rather than nature. She says, "It does not seem that we need spend much time on the question of whether Cleopatra, a kind of Ptolemaic bad seed, actually inherited a concentrated set of chromosomes genetically programming her to murder her siblings." Now, regarding physical effects, she also notes that while it is very likely that Ptolemaic inbreeding would result in genetic complications, it isn't inevitable. Quote, "Combinations of genetic material are random, not determined by a genetically or divinely mandated program of punishment for offenders against the taboo." I think we kind of assume that inbreeding is guaranteed to quickly and inevitably result in gross and fatal deformities within a family, and genetic issues are definitely more likely, but they're not inevitable. When it comes to the Ptolemies, we don't have any evidence that they suffered any mental defect, although Aja says, quote, "We might want to qualify Ptolemy XI's ill-advised murder of the beloved Cleopatra Berenike as a singular instance of very slow cerebration." But we also don't have any evidence of decreased fertility in the dynasty. Most of the incestuous unions actually resulted in offspring. And although some did die young, infant mortality wasn't greater among the Ptolemies than in any other dynasty. Cleopatra II successfully reproduced with both of her brothers, and even possibly being 40 when she bore her last son. While Cleopatra III, who was a child of full-sibling incest and married to her uncle, had 5 healthy babies very quickly, all of whom had their own children. So we don't see any clear negative effect mentally or regarding fertility when it comes to the Ptolemies. Some of the Ptolemies were also described as quite healthy. For example, Ptolemy V was seen as very fit and athletic. But you also have Ptolemies who are described in much more negative ways. So Ptolemy VIII, with the epithet Viscon, which means potbelly, has been used to demonstrate possible effects of inbreeding in the dynasty. He is described by Justin as follows. To the Romans, he was as ludicrous a figure as he was a cruel one to his fellow citizen. He had an ugly face and was short in stature, and he had a distended belly more like an animal's than a man's. The repulsiveness of his appearance was heightened by his dress, which was exceedingly fine-spun to the point of transparency, just as if he had some motive for putting on display what a decent man should have made every effort to conceal. But the thing is, Ptolemy VIII wasn't actually a child of sibling incest. In fact, his parents were third cousins. Aja says he probably had a share in some of the freshest genetic material that had been in the family for some time. And there's no reason to assume that his obesity was from inbreeding, especially when his great-great-grandfather, Magus of Cyrene, was described in the same way. Quote, "He abandoned himself to luxury and was weighted down with monstrous masses of flesh in his last days. In fact, he choked himself to death because he was so fat, never taking any exercise and always eating quantities of food." We can probably assume that their obesity was from their indulgent lifestyle as royals rather than any sort of health issue resulting from inbreeding. In fact, Athenaeus claims that through indulgence and luxury, Ptolemy III was, quote, "corrupted with fat and with a belly of such a size that it would have been hard to measure it with one's arms." His son, Ptolemy X, was also described in a very similar way, so we can see this pattern of overindulgence throughout the dynasty that wasn't incestuously caused, but was just a result of their very lavish lifestyles. So historical evidence doesn't actually suggest that Ptolemies suffered any defects from their inbreeding, but as the saying goes, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So it doesn't mean that they absolutely had no negative consequences just because we don't have any evidence that they did. But we certainly can't 100% say that they did, as some have done. Aja rightly points out that if we didn't know of their incest, we actually wouldn't suspect any genetic issues based on the historical record. Now, while we might share a negative view on incest, it actually differs between and within cultures, and this can be expressed by language. For example, the Latin term incestum connotes impurity or defilement. The Chinese term luanlun combines the terms for disorder and social relationship. And in African Swana, the term bodohodi means something ominous, predicting evil. In non-romantic European languages, terms usually focus on, quote, blood, contamination, or shame, such as the German term Blutschande. Hopefully I got all these right and I didn't butcher them.
Tiswana.
So we can see based on language that generally incest bears a negative perception, just for differing reasons, but even then this isn't always the case, which we'll get into. But even when it is considered bad, not all agree on what is bad, even within cultures. For example, the Law Code of Hammurabi orders the exile of a father who commits incest with his daughter, burning alive for a mother and son who commit incest, and doesn't even mention sibling incest. A more modern example is America, where some states allow first cousins to marry and others don't. I actually found out recently while I was looking this up that it's almost 50-50, which I didn't know. I thought it was like 3 states. Like, I feel like people act like it's 3 states. It's like Texas, Alabama. It's like half the states. Anyway, we can see that not only do the same punishments not apply to all forms of incest, but there are actually disagreements on where the line is drawn as well. Now let's look at Ptolemaic Egypt, where the main ethnic groups at the time were Greeks, Egyptians, and Jews. So the ancient Greeks didn't actually have a specific term for incest. They used terms such as anosios or anagnosunesia, which means holy impure intercourse, or gamos asabes, which means impious marriage. Both of these suggest that incest was viewed by the ancient Greeks as an impure act that offended the gods. Asia also determines that ancient Greeks associated incest with a lack of restraint and loss of virtue. They banned sexual intimacy between parents and their offspring and linear relatives, although this wasn't properly reinforced, and they also had unwritten laws about intimacy between siblings. When it comes to the ancient Egyptians, there's really no evidence to suggest that they categorised their marriages based on whether or not they were incestuous. There aren't any laws regarding incest, and there isn't even a legal term for it. It's also not included under the category for evil, chaos, and taboo, and there's nothing really to suggest that those practicing sibling marriage were ostracised or lived any differently from the rest of society. However, throughout almost 3,000 years of pharaonic history, there's almost no evidence for the practice of incest among the populace, while evidence for royal families is very limited. Prior to the Ptolemaic period, marriages between more distant relatives, such as first or second cousins, appeared a lot more common among non-royals than sibling marriages. Although these can be pretty hard to identify in the historical record, it can be quite hard to tell exactly how people were related, and this is especially difficult when they didn't really categorise their marriages based on whether or not they were incestuous. Among these non-royals, we do find some evidence of half-sibling marriages, and very rarely we do come across full-sibling marriages. Some rulers may have also married their half-sisters or even their daughters, such as Ramses II and Amenhotep III. Both of these kings were from the New Kingdom, which was from dynasties 18 to 20, and interestingly, in the 18th dynasty, some gendered terms referring to relatives also began to mean husband and wife. I thought that was something interesting to include. It's not conclusive of anything, but I do think it's interesting that these words kind of come to be mixed together. Maybe it means something in relation to incestuous marriages, maybe it doesn't, I just think it's interesting. Now, incest among non-royals changed in later Egyptian history, possibly beginning with the Hellenistic period, or the Ptolemaic period. So in Greco-Roman Egypt, brother-sister marriage appears to have been a lot more common. About 1/3 of the populace practiced this more extreme incest, and this was especially prominent among the Greeks. Scholars have even theorised that it was confined just to this ethnic group, and we'll very briefly touch on that again later. Now in Judaism, incest is generally considered a morally defiling sexual sin and an abomination. Now abomination is used in relation to moral impurity, including acts of idolatry and bloodshed. And these abominations were seen as defiling to the land of Israel and the sanctuary of God, and these were not things that could be rectified. Commandment 56 forbids offspring of an incestuous or adulterous union from God's assembly for 10 generations and from marrying a person of good standing. These incestuous unions, though, depended on gender and could be somewhat complex. So, for example, only a man could not marry his parents' siblings, only a woman could not marry her sibling's child, and both men and women could not marry step-parents. Wikipedia, although not always reliable, does have a very good graph with a basic overview of attitudes towards specific relationships based on gender, as determined by Leviticus 18 and 20 and the Deuteronomic Code. So, prior to the Ptolemaic period, full-sibling marriage was almost unprecedented in all three of these cultures. We know it was negatively viewed by the Jews and Greeks, and limited evidence shows that it was never normalized in Egypt. However, scholars agree that the marriage of Arsinoe II to Ptolemy II, which remember was the first in the dynasty, wasn't actually a major issue to the population. That doesn't mean that there was no opposition, but there was nothing major enough to prevent it from becoming a standardized practice later on. So we have two main sources on the reception of Arsinoe II and Ptolemy II's marriage, and these are Socrates and Theocritus. So Socrates represented those against the marriage, declaring that Ptolemy was, quote, thrusting his phallus in an unholy hole, end quote. Socrates was punished for this. He was either exiled or imprisoned and escaped, and ultimately he was locked in a box and thrown into the ocean. As far as I know, I think this became a pretty iconic line. I mean, it survives to us today, so it must have been liked by people in some aspect. And we get the idea from it that we probably don't really get the full picture of ancient attitudes when people in opposition are imprisoned or killed. I think being locked in a box and thrown into the ocean is a pretty scary threat. Now, Theocritus was much nicer when he spoke about the sibling couple. From Zeus let us begin, and with Zeus in our poems, muses, let us make end. For of immortals he is best, but of men let Ptolemy II be named, first, last, and in the midst. For of men he is most excellent. He and his noble wife, than whom none better clasp in her arms a husband in his halls, loving with all her heart her brother and her spouse. After this fashion was accomplished the sacred bridal also of the immortals whom Queen Rhea bore to rule Olympus. And single in the couch that Iris, virgin still, her hands made pure with perfumes, strews for the sleep of Zeus and Hera. Now we'll dive into this a little bit more later to talk about the meaning behind it, but from these two sources, it's pretty clear that there were complicated feelings towards the union of Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II. There certainly was backlash, but there was also some appraisal, and we can also see that there wasn't enough backlash to stop it from becoming a standardized practice. However, we do see a lot of critique towards Ptolemaic incest in the later ancient world, especially from the Romans. So we discussed how Ptolemy VIII married his full sister upon the death of the reigning king Ptolemy VI. Justin claims that Ptolemy VIII murdered his surviving nephew upon their marriage and, quote, entered his sister's bed still dripping with the gall of her son, end quote. Now it is entirely likely that Ptolemy VIII might have seen fit to remove his nephew as a rival for the throne, as his sister might have killed her new brother husband so that her son could rule. But the scene may also be very dramatised to play up the perceived moral depravity of the incestuous Ptolemies. On the other hand, though, we do actually have other accounts of Ptolemy VIII's violence. Diodorus Siculus, who was writing around a century later, claims that after Cleopatra II ousted her daughter and brother husband from Alexandria, Ptolemy VIII murdered their shared teenage son Memphis. He dismembered him and sent him in a box the night before her birthday celebrations to punish her. Now again, he might have killed him to prevent Cleopatra II from using her last surviving son as co-ruler and thereby keeping Ptolemy VIII from the throne. But did he actually do something this awful? Well, a new god actually appeared under the name Neos Philopator in the title of the priest of Alexander. As early as May 118 BCE, he was positioned between Theos Philometor, deceased, and the Theoi who were living. Neos Philopator also became part of the list of the Ptolemaic kings after a decree that same year. Some scholars have theorized that Neos Philopator was Memphis deified after his death, which would confirm his death if true. But Philopator also means father lover, so it would be pretty fucked up if Ptolemy VIII murdered his son and then his son was given the name father lover. But this was also kind of at a time that the Ptolemies were trying to establish peace between each other and sort things out. So it is entirely possible that this was Memphis and that he was murdered by his father. Whether or not he was actually murdered this violently isn't really clear. I think that these are based in some truth. I think that it is entirely possible Ptolemy VIII murdered both of these boys. But I think that the Romans are really playing up the moral depravity of the Ptolemies, and they view them this way because of their incestuous unions. Writing in the 1st century CE, Lucan also includes incest in his depiction of Cleopatra VII as a calculated and dangerous seductress. This is a prevailing idea based on misogyny as well as Orientalism that can be quite common when we look at ancient women, both from ancient sources and from relatively modern sources. Early archaeology wasn't great. Now Lucan says, "Do you alone hang back, when all others hasten to the bed of the princess? The wicked sister is marrying her brother. The Roman general she has married already. She was able to conquer Caesar's heart by drugs. If you put your trust in the boy, I pity you. If a single night brings them together, if her brother once submits to her embraces with incestuous heart, and drinks in unlawful passion on pretense of natural affection, then he will grant her your head and mine, each perhaps in return for a kiss." Now, we already mentioned that scholars aren't even entirely sure if she did marry her brothers, let alone that these were consummated unions. Aegis says that it's unlikely that these words, quote, represented anything like historical truth, end quote. Really, these probably represented the patriarchal bias that these men had at a woman being in power, especially a foreign one that is threatening Rome. This isn't uncommon when we look at historical sources, especially the Romans. It also shows us Roman disgust at the Ptolemaic practice of incestuous marriage. So again, generally, incest in the ancient world was viewed negatively and was almost unprecedented. Although there was no impactful outrage at the dynasty's first full-sibling union, we know that there was at least some level of disapproval among the populace as expressed by Socrates. So why have the Ptolemies established this as a standardized practice? Well, the first reason that you probably thought of was dynastic security, and you are right. Good job. So a dynastic security is probably the most well-known motivation for incestuous marriages, as they ensure that power, wealth, and territory remain within the family, particularly the immediate family. So the Habsburgs, which is the family of Charles II of Spain, is actually a great example of a dynasty that married for this exact reason. Avoiding marriage to those from foreign or high-ranking families can restrict privilege and keep the throne safe, at least for the main dynasty. Another example is Antiochus II of the Seleucid Empire marrying both Laodice and Ptolemy II's daughter Berenike Syra. So when Antiochus II died, both royal women made rival claims for the throne on behalf of their sons. Another example for the Seleucids is Archelaus the Younger, whose family line intersected with the Seleucid dynasty. His connection to the royal family allowed him to present himself as a legitimate king. This all happened while the ruling king, Antiochus III, who was the son of the previous king Seleucus II, was campaigning in the east. So obviously, avoiding marrying outsiders makes it easier to keep the throne within the family. Another reason monarchs may choose incestuous unions is to ensure the purity of their blood. So they might refuse to muddy it with that of less prestigious individuals. This wasn't just practiced by the Ptolemies, but also the non-royal Greek and Macedonian settlers in Egypt. They viewed themselves as part of the ruling class and chose a sibling marriage to avoid breeding with Egyptians. This is what I was talking about before when we said that a third of the population in Egypt during the Ptolemaic period practiced more extreme incestuous marriages, and that was quite common among the Greeks. And again, it is believed to have potentially been practiced just by the Greeks. But for dynastic security and purity, the Ptolemies didn't really need to marry their full siblings. They could have just married their cousins like many other dynasties have done. The unique status of the king's sister actually plays a significant role in the choice of full-sibling marriages, and actually granted these women significant power that even put them on par with the kings. So firstly, incestuous marriages can be seen as the outcome of hypergamy, which is where females seek to marry upwards. Who is the king's sister to marry? There's not many people that she can marry upwards to. But on top of this, sisters can also be viewed as mirrors of their brothers, and I think that this is very interesting. So the sisters are seen as, quote, as close as one can come to female versions of kings, end quote. They share family, status, upbringing, making them a natural couple with a very strong sibling trust. They are on the same side, they're in the same immediate family. From birth, these women are granted a very special status and role within the dynasty, which makes their transition into the role of the ruler's wife be seen as something easier, it also grants them equal importance to the king as a repository power. And we can actually see great emphasis placed on the sister wives for this exact reason. We can see this in poetry such as Theocritus, as we talked about before, but also Callimachus. We see it in the adoption of epithets like Theodelphos. We can also see this in the emphasis of sibling marriages in Ptolemaic documents, the persistence of Arsinoe II's cult, and the emphasis of the sister wives in coinage. Ptolemy II placed enormous emphasis on his sister wife Arsinoe II, including depictions of him worshipping her as a deity. For example, we have the Gate of Philadelphia. Here he is making offerings to Isis and Arsinoe II. She was advertised in the Python-stela as his natural political partner. Even in her death, her position as a sister wife was a central part of her identity. She was granted the title the brother-loving goddess. And it's believed that a major motivation for her deification in death was ensuring the continuation of the sibling couple's union. Deifying Arsinoe II, quote, would be an effective way to evoke the presence and unity of the dynastic couple, despite the... Squite?
Only 4,000 squeet. Squeet?
It would be an effective way to evoke the presence and unity of the dynastic couple, despite the queen's death dividing it in practice. Now, on top of being viewed as mirrors of the king, the offspring of this full-sibling union can also be viewed as a sort of clone of the king through its concentration of royal genetic material. This is aided by the reuse of names throughout the dynasty. We only have 4 names, as I mentioned before. All the males are named Ptolemy, and all the females are either Berenike, Arsinoe, or Cleopatra. And so this creates the sense of the king being almost reincarnated into his son over and over again. Ultimately, we can see a very clear relation to the status of the king's sister and the Ptolemaic dynasty's choice to specifically practice full-sibling incestuous marriages. Another reason may be that the Ptolemies believed that they were emulating their Egyptian predecessors. So as discussed, there were very few sibling marriages in Egypt prior to the Ptolemaic period, and even with those that occurred, it was never the norm among the Egyptians. But this didn't matter to the ancient Greeks, who believed that sibling marriage was normal among the Egyptian royalty and commoners. Even today, people still kind of believe that it was common. Like, I was looking at something when I was researching. I think it was just a regular website. I think I was looking for example families or something who had also committed incest. And there was one that referred to how incest was very common in Egypt. But evidence doesn't support this. At least not until the Ptolemaic period. I think this comes down to the view that, a kind of Orientalist view that a lot of like Eastern or Southern nations are maybe more primitive and so they will commit more incest. But ironically, it is the Greeks that were the one practicing it the most. It was in the Ptolemaic period, when the region was colonized by the Greeks, that they really began practicing incest. At least that's what the evidence suggests. Anyway, Diodorus Siculus wrote, quote, "The Egyptians also made a law, they say, contrary to the general custom of mankind, permitting men to marry their sisters, this being due to the success attained by Isis in this respect." As mentioned earlier, we don't actually have any evidence of Egyptian laws on incest for or against it. But this doesn't really matter. The point is that the Greeks believed that it was normal and therefore could have believed that they were emulating the previous pharaohs. Although some scholars have argued that the early Ptolemies actually took little to no interest in the Egyptian view of the dynasty. But physical evidence shows that there was actually cultural hybridization. So hybridization refers to asymmetrical interactions that are used by colonizers to reduce differences between the ethnic groups in their conquered territories. So many scholars actually agree that one of the main aims of the Ptolemies was to unify the Greeks and Egyptians to ensure that the dynasty maintained their power as new rulers. Now, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's statuette of Arsinoe II actually expresses this hybridization, which aims for images of the queen to be understood by and significant to both Egyptians and Greeks. So it has Greek elements in its rounded face, the cornucopia that she holds, and her corkscrew locks. And it also has Egyptian ones, such as the knotted garment and her stance, as well as the Egyptian hieroglyphs on the back. Many other depictions of the queen include Egyptian crowns, tripartite wigs, and uraei, while others are outright Egyptian. And a uraeus is a sacred Egyptian cobra that would appear on headdresses and were very symbolic in Egypt. For example, the W race was very unique to Arsinoe II, and it can be seen on her statue right here on her headdress. Sally Ann Ashton's 2001 book, Ptolemaic Royal Sculpture from Egypt, Interaction Between Greek and Egyptian Traditions, analyses representations of Ptolemaic rulers in depth. It's a very interesting source if you're actually interested in this topic. She maintains the uniformity of public and private works promoting the dynasty, confirms that Ptolemaic images were actually controlled by the royal house. So basically it's clear that the early Ptolemies were actually trying to appeal to the native Egyptians, and that they were aiming for this hybridization. A more convincing argument against the idea of the Ptolemies aiming to emulate their predecessors comes from Aja, who claims that the Ptolemies didn't actually need to adopt incest as a consistent pattern throughout the dynasty if they wanted to satisfy the Egyptians. However, she does say that it might have inspired them. She says it can't really be a coincidence that they adopted a practice believed by their own culture, quote, to be one of the most striking local customs, end quote. Aja also points out that even if the ancient Egyptians did practice incest, the question would still remain as to why they did this. We've already discussed dynastic security and the status of sisters, but there were even bigger factors at play. So the Ptolemies' full-sibling marriages can be considered part of a performance to convey the dynasty's power and divinity to the public. As a taboo action, engaging in royal incest presents the household as holy to some extent, as only the gods are allowed to engage in similar behaviours. Many mythologies, including Greek, Persian and Egyptian, conceive the world as being created as a result of sex between closely related divinities, whether these are brothers and sisters or parents and their offspring. In ancient Greek mythology, chaos existed alone in a void. In some myths, he created offspring, and reproduction occurred between him and his offspring, as well as between the offspring themselves. In other myths, they also emerged from the void. One of these early deities was Gaia, or Earth. She gave birth to Uranus, the sky, and then they reproduced. She also later castrated him with the help of her son, Kronos, who married his sister, Rhea, but that's not something we'll get into much today. It's just interesting and another example of incest in this Greek mythology. So we can see from this very small section of the family that incest was common in ancient Greek creation myths and played a very core role. An ancient Greek example is the Aeneid, which was a family of 9 deities worshipped in Heliopolis. The head of the family, Atum, created himself and existed alone, also in a void. He then created Shu and Tefnut, who reproduced to create Geb and Nut, who did the same thing to create Osiris, Isis, Seth and Nephthys. So this is just one example from Egyptian mythology. We do have a lot of different creation myths, but both of these that I discussed show that inbreeding was tied to divinity and creative power through Egyptian and Greek creation myths. Now, many cultures from throughout history elevated royalty to a divine or semi-divine status that allowed them to commit incest. An example of this is divine rule. But royalty wasn't an exception to the taboo. They actually practiced incest within the framework of the taboo. In other words, it remained taboo, and in committing this act, the Ptolemies did what most could not and established themselves as untouchable by standards of human morality. Aja says, quote, "It was only incest among humans that was loathsome to the Greek gods, who had every right to engage in the practice themselves. For royalty to follow suit was of course to suggest that incestuous royals were more than human, that they were raised to the plane of divinity." By engaging in incest, the Ptolemies also emulated the eros gamos, or holy wedlock, of the gods in both Greek and Egyptian traditions, which gave them access to use epithets, cults, and images associated with these deities. On the Greek side, they had Zeus and Hera, the sibling gods that ruled Olympus. So Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II were compared to these figures by Theocritus. Theocritus compared Ptolemy II to Zeus, mentioned Zeus and Hera's shared mother Rhea, who was part of a full-sibling union with Kronos, and he also described the goddess Isis preparing the marital bed for the sibling gods. On the Egyptian side, they had the siblings Isis and Osiris, as well as their child Horus. So these three were already tied to the pharaonic throne in several ways, including the king traditionally being conceptualized as embodying Horus in life and Osiris in death. Isis and Osiris were also described as having a very strong and passionate love for one another, being said to have made love in the womb.
What the fuck? Is this allowed? What the fuck? Is that allowed?
In Egyptian mythology, their brother Seth is said to have murdered and dismembered Osiris, much like poor little Memphites. So Isis collected his scattered limbs, partially revived him, and conceived Horus. Aegis says that this is reminiscent of the brutality and sexuality of early creation myths, underlining the creative and chaotic power of incest. She explains that mythological incest, whether it's between humans or gods, is inevitably fruitful, especially in creation myths. This ties to the cornucopia, which symbolises fertility and abundance. This was a major symbol for the Ptolemies, especially when we look at depictions of Arsinoe II. She was often represented with double cornucopia containing Egyptian fruits. For example, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's statuette, she's holding this cornucopia, and it's also commonly shown on coins of this queen. This union of Ptolemaic rulers mirrored those of the gods in both Egyptian and Greek cultures, imbuing the mortal king and queen with a cosmic creative power that both ethnic groups could understand. This also relates to wider attempts by the Ptolemies to create a unified cultural identity through hybridization to ensure that the dynasty maintained power. The Ptolemaic dynasty was characterized by excess, lavishness, and overindulgence. Excess and unrestrained indulgence included sex and food, as well as incest, which, as I mentioned before, was associated with a lack of self-restraint in the Hellenistic world. The kings were also associated with Dionysus. For example, the procession of Ptolemy II was centered around this deity. Dionysus represented indulgence, while his gift of wine could potentially lead to forbidden sexual acts, including incest. At least this is the observation made by historians. I would be very concerned if getting drunk made you sleep with your sibling. Performance of overindulgence also tied to descriptions of rulers' overconsumption of food. For example, Ptolemy VIII, as we discussed before, Asia labelled him as, quote, a presentation that deliberately laid emphasis on the wealth, luxury, and magnificence of the ruling dynasty. But not all perceived him this way. For example, Plutarch and Diodorus Siculus described Roman disgust and disapproval at his lifestyle. Scipio Africanus and his fellow ambassadors came to Alexandria to survey the entire kingdom. Ptolemy welcomed the men with a great reception and much pomp, held costly banquets for them, and conducting them about, showed them his palace and other royal treasures. Now the Roman envoys were men of superior virtue, and since their normal diet was limited to a few dishes, and only such as were conducive to health, they were scornful of his extravagance as detrimental to both body and mind. The envoys apprehended that a very great power could be built in Egypt, if this kingdom should ever find rulers worthy of it. The king could hardly keep up with them in walking because of his inactive life and his pampering of his body. What? The king could hardly keep up with them in walking because of his active life and his pampering of his body. And Scipio whispered softly to Panetius, already the Alexandrians have received some benefit from our visit, for it is owing to us that they have seen their king walk. But as I said, while these displays could be off-putting to some, it actually represented power and divinity for the Ptolemaic dynasty. Aegis says that, quote, excessive indulgence, particularly in things forbidden, underscores the absolute omnipotence of royalty. There is no superior power capable of coercion, and not even the gods would intervene to check Ptolemaic behaviour. So in other words, restraint can be considered something that is externally imposed. When one indulges, especially excessively, in forbidden behaviour, it seems that there is no superior power that can restrain their excess. It seems as though the Ptolemaic dynasty is divine. Now this is especially important when we remember that the Ptolemies were a Greek Macedonian dynasty, they were not Egyptian, and that the traditional Egyptian pharaohs had also been viewed as divine. Now there is a lot to this that I won't get into today, but remember how I said earlier that the pharaoh was conceptualized as the embodiment of Horus in life and Osiris in death. That is just one aspect of that conception of the pharaoh as divine. Now let's quickly jump back to Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II to discuss how financial excess ties into this. I said that they flaunted their incestuous relationship through epithets, such as the sibling gods, and also how it remained a prominent aspect of the queen's identity as the brother-loving goddess. But the Ptolemies also expressed opulence through festivals honouring the rulers, including the sibling gods Arsinoe II and Ptolemy II. They also did this through physical representations of them. This is something I'm not going to go into with as much depth, as it's a little bit off topic, but there is more information on this in the textual version linked in the description. I just include Athanasius' description of a festival that Ptolemy II organised in honour of his father, Ptolemy I. The lengthy account of extreme extravagance included dinner vessels weighing 10,000 talents of silver altogether, 200 gold tripods on silver stands, 1,000 slaves belonging to an associate of the king carrying silver vessels, quote, none of which weighed less than 1,000 drachmas, end quote. 600 slaves belonging to the king carrying gold vessels, a double altar covered with gilded ivy leaves and a gold grapevine garland, and boys dressed in purple tunics carrying saffron and gold platters, as well as frankincense and myrrh. This is just one example of how extravagant the celebrations of the Ptolemaic rulers were. But we also know of very lavish depictions of Ptolemaic royalty, including Arsinoe II, the brother-loving goddess. Now, although these don't usually survive to us because precious materials are often reused, we do actually have some evidence. One is Pliny's description of the very wealthy decoration of the Arsinoeum, which was a shrine dedicated to Arsinoe II, including an image of the queen made with very valuable materials. There's also the Metropolitan Museum of Art's statuette of Arsinoe, which we've been looking at, which actually has traces of gold around its neck, showing that it was once gilded. Displaying wealth, especially when honouring the sibling gods, would further elevate the cosmic status of this incestuous dynasty. Bell and Rebecca theorised that expressions of opulence emphasise holiness by imbuing spectators with the impression that those controlling the wealth cannot be mere human. The power must come from sources, quote, beyond the immediate control of the human continuity, end quote. This grants rulers additional strength and authority while binding the kingdom together. We also have evidence that the Ptolemies held feasts and ordered sacrifices honouring Arsinoe II, which can be viewed as a collective display of religious adherence and loyalty to the Ptolemaic dynasty. If you're interested in the ideology behind these public rituals, I do go into it in a bit more depth in the textual version. I just don't want this video to be too long and it's a little bit off the topic, I suppose. But this is another interesting way of looking at how the Ptolemaic dynasty used these events, especially honouring these figures whose identity centred around their incestuous marriage, to add to that sense that they were divine and create that sense of loyalty. So to summarise, full-sibling incest was employed by the Ptolemaic dynasty to express their divine strength and authority while maintaining dynastic security. The unique position of the king's sister, ideology surrounding incest and excess, and ancient mythologies all were key factors in the decision to consistently practice full-sibling incest throughout the Ptolemaic period. Ultimately, the royal house was represented as a, quote, microcosm of the supernatural order, end quote, and this mandates loyalty from the population and affirms the authority of the ruling dynasty. And you're probably wondering, because divinity is so central to their motivation, why would anybody actually believe that they were divine? Well, Rebecca's has a really interesting way of looking at this. He believes that people may not have confidently believed that the Ptolemies were actually divine, but had belief in belief. So this is the belief that it is good to believe in a particular idea, individual, or system, and that belief should be maintained. So this can be a belief that is imposed or one that is adopted. Rebecca states, believing in the nature of the rulers was something good was conditioned by the rulers offering protection, safety, and security. He points out that the Ptolemies were doing what the traditional Egyptian gods had failed to do, by protecting and rescuing the Egyptians from poverty, famine, and enemies, and also freeing them from Persian rule. All of this conformed to the traditional duties of the pharaoh as per Ma'at. So the Egyptians viewed time not in a linear way like us, but in a circular way. They believed that the world began in chaos and would eventually revert back to that chaos, and that the king's duty was to prevent this by supporting the gods and the temples, protecting the Egyptians, stopping sources of chaos such as foreigners, etc. And so we can see the Ptolemies kind of trying to conform to this to present themselves as something that is good to follow, good to believe in. The idea that the dynasty would protect its followers is also aided by displays of wealth and power, as well as the execution of Sodades for speaking against Arsinoe II and Ptolemy II's incestuous marriage and what that union symbolised. Whether or not you're convinced, this is just another way of looking at the relationship between the Ptolemaic dynasty, or any dynasty, and those that they rule when it comes to ideology and expressions of divine status. Especially when we still have dynasties today that claim divine right. So the Ptolemaic dynasty was very complex, and this is only an overview of the incestuous unions and why they chose full sibling marriage specifically. There are a lot of other ways that the Ptolemaic dynasty accentuated their power and divine status. There are a lot of very interesting aspects of the dynasty that don't even relate to that, and also a lot of very interesting figures that I will actually dive into in the future, such as Cleopatra VII, Arsinoe II, and maybe Cleopatra's daughter, Cleopatra Selene. So these will be part of my Ancient Women series on Threads of History, and more information about this series is available on the website linked below. That also has the textual version with all the images and sources. Thank you so much for listening today. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe, or follow if you're on Spotify, so that I know to keep making these. And also let me know what else you'd like to see future episodes on. Future episodes I'm considering at the moment include Akhenaten or Akhenaton, Roman sexuality, the concept of the wandering womb, and twilight sleep. I'm planning on sticking to longer content, but this might have been a little bit longer than the rest of them would be, just because I had to go through the whole family tree. And I'll also try to upload regularly, but I'm a student at the moment, so I probably won't be uploading as much as I would like to. So again, thank you so much for joining me today, and I really look forward to seeing you next time. See ya!